Welcome back to the deep dive. There's that specific feeling you get from a great horror film.
Hmm.
It's it's not always the big CGI monster
Yeah.
or, a bucket of blood.
No, not at all.
Sometimes it's just a moment of this profound, cold dread that just locks itself into your memory.
Yeah.
Maybe it was a simple sound or
Yeah.
or the way the camera just held in an empty hallway for a beat too long.
And you walk away with this strange mix, right? It's part primal fear, but it's also this intellectual curiosity. You're left
Yeah.
wondering, how? How did they do that? How did they get under my skin so effectively?
Exactly. And that is our mission today.
That's it. You've brought us this phenomenal stack of sources. We've got
Yes.
director interviews, critical analyses of, major 21st century horror, detailed breakdowns of these landmark scenes.
Yeah.
And we are going deep. We're
Yeah.
looking at the technical and the psychological mechanics of fear. We're basically breaking down the levers that filmmakers, especially directors like James Wan, used to skip past your logical brain entirely.
And go straight for the gut.
Straight for that instinctual evolutionary fear response.
Yeah. So just to be clear, we're not reviewing movies here. We are dissecting the blueprints.
Exactly.
Our sources give us this incredible look at the surgical precision of sound designers, the intentional use of architecture to create panic, and just these cinematic techniques that force your brain to basically become a threat detection system.
Mm-hmm.
We've got material covering everything from the sound philosophy behind the Conjuring franchise to some really surprising case studies from international cinema like Infested at the Bay and the Korean thriller Memories of Murder.
We're going to focus our analysis on 3 key techniques that are just instrumental in triggering these deep instinctual fear states.
Okay.
First, we're going to examine what we're calling the sonic anchor, how a familiar, totally benign sound like a child's clap is corrupted and weaponized to trigger a high arousal fear state. It's essentially hijacking your brain's threat assessment.
Okay, hijacking. I like that. What's number 2?
Second, we're going to look at negative space. This is the deliberate use of empty corners and off-screen areas to activate what's called hypervigilance.
Hypervigilance.
Yeah, that exhausting, desperate need for your brain to locate a threat that the filmmaker knows is hiding or, might not even be there yet.
And finally,
We'll explore the deep psychological roots of the evolutionary threat.
the basement.
The basement, the dark hallway, the tight crawl space. We're going to dig into why these specific restrictive environments tap into our ancestral inherent fear of predators in places where we can't see and can't easily escape. When people think about horror, the first thing that comes to mind is usually visual. The shock, the gore, the monster reveal. That's what takes center stage.
Right.
But sound is, I would argue, it's the single most crucial element in building a sustained atmosphere of dread.
Okay.
I mean, look at the sound talent on the Conjuring universe. They operate under a really specific philosophy. They talk about needing a realistic use of sound and a restrained mixing approach.
Wait, restrained mixing? That sounds counterintuitive for a horror movie, doesn't it? I mean, isn't horror all about those sudden loud jump scares?
It is, but sustained dread isn't. That restraint is key. It means that for most of the movie, the soundscape is grounded, it's real.
So it sounds normal.
It sounds totally normal. The sources note they minimize those big orchestral scores. They avoid the constant low-frequency effects. That rumbling that basically telegraphs, hey, something bad's about to happen.
Right, the LFE hum.
Exactly. So the environment feels safe, it feels trustworthy, and that makes the eventual intrusion of the supernatural. That one moment the LFE does hit or a sound comes from somewhere impossible, all the more jarring.
Because the reality you were trusting is suddenly betrayed.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack this with probably the most famous example of this philosophy in action, the hide and clap scene from the original The Conjuring.
Masterclass.
It really is. It functions like a 5-minute contained short film.
Yeah.
The premise, like you said, starts so simply, so domestically. Carolyn Perrin is sitting down late at night, and she hears this rhythmic clapping.
And she thinks it's her daughters.
Right, she thinks they're playing a harmless game of hide and clap.
And the tension begins immediately. The second she walks down that dark corridor and finds her daughters are fast asleep in their beds.
That's the moment.
Yeah.
That initial, innocent, domestic sound, that rhythmic clap, is instantly corrupted.
That is the definition of the sonic anchor for anxiety. The sound becomes an anchor for the dread you're about to feel.
Okay, let's stop there, because you mentioned a psychological mechanism earlier. The high arousal fear state. Can you break that down for us?
Absolutely. High arousal fear isn't the jolt you get from a jump scare. It's a state of heightened physiological readiness. It happens when your brain detects a threat that it can't categorize or locate.
I see.
I mean, think about a clap. It's universally positive, right?
Applause.
Applause. Or at worst, it's just an attention-getting, non-threatening signal. But by placing it in a dark, isolated late-night corridor, after you've confirmed the source, the children can't be making it, the film creates cognitive dissonance.
Your brain is getting two conflicting messages.
Exactly. The brain is presented with a familiar signal coming from an impossible, unseen, and therefore hostile source.
So the brain is just screaming. The signal is normal, but the context is hostile. Initiate immediate threat response.
Yes. But because the threat is undefined, you're trapped. You stay in that high arousal state, scanning, waiting, just hyper-aware.
And Juan is a master of stretching that tension. I mean, the source material says he utilizes every unbearable second to his advantage. We follow Carolyn as she just creeps through the house, searching.
And the audience is trapped right there with her, trapped in the anticipation of that sound. We know exactly what's coming, another clap. We just don't know where it's coming from or what will be revealed when it happens.
I remember watching that scene, and the critique we read was spot on. It said you just wish the character would run back into bed and pretend like nothing's happening.
Yes. Because the dread of that sound is so much worse than whatever the final reveal is going to be.
The power is in the anticipation.
Yeah.
It's the contrast between the sound's familiarity and the absolute dread it creates. That's the genius of it.
And that weaponization of sound, it goes beyond just corrupting familiar noises. It's also about mixing sounds that just don't belong together, creating this profound auditory dissonance.
It's another way to signal to the brain that the environment is. It's fundamentally unstable.
That's broken.
That brings us to a really fantastic example for the Argentinian film, When Evil Lurks.
Which is so good at this.
It really is. It relies so heavily on making the natural world sound just wrong. There's a scene with a sweet little girl and her smiling dog, a moment that should feel totally comforting.
But the audience already knows. We know about the demonic corruption that's spreading through the community.
And the film mixes this heavy, foreboding musical score. You know, the classic sound of impending doom, with the crystal clear, almost aggressive sounds of birds chirping outside.
And those two sounds, as the source says, they just don't sit right with us when together.
Not at all.
That clash signals that the natural world itself is corrupted. Birds chirping should mean peace, daylight. The score means imminent, unnatural violence.
So your ears are telling you two completely contradictory stories. And that auditory dissonance creates this deep unease. It signals instability long before the visual horror even happens.
Which in this case is the horrifying moment when the sweet little girl's dog suddenly mauls her.
Yeah. The sound has already done all the psychological work before the visual shock even hits you.
And then you can take that even further. Sometimes the most effective sound is the one that's completely isolated from any visual context. This is where we move from sonic dissonance to sonic negative space.
And that is just maximizing the found footage film, The Bay.
Totally.
So in this scene, the camera's perspective is fixed. It's just a police car's dash cam. It's not moving. Two deputies have gone inside a house to investigate someone screaming.
And they don't come back out. The officers disappear, and our perspective is totally static. We can only listen to the nightmare that's unfolding inside that house.
We hear this horrific audio. An infected person inside begging the officers to shoot them. And then you hear the officers start to panic, and these sickening, wet sounds of the infection taking hold.
The critique we read is absolutely right here. The power is undeniable because letting the audience fill in the blanks is more effective than anything you could show them.
It's leveraging that high arousal state we were just talking about.
Exactly.
By taking away the visual information, the pure audio is amplified.
Yeah.
And your imagination, which is just fueled by fear and the unknown, it's forced to construct a scenario that's way more personal, way more horrific than any special effect could ever manage.
It's the ultimate psychological intrusion. It uses the absence of sight to maximize the power of sound.
And that feels like a perfect segue.
It really is. If the absence of a visual forces us to build horror with sound, then architecture forces us to build horror in the shadows we can't escape.
That's a great pivot. So we're transitioning from the psychological environment built by sound to the architectural, the physical environment. We're moving into the realm of evolutionary threat.
Right. And our brains are biologically hardwired. I mean, millions of years of evolution have programmed us to fear enclosed, low-visibility spaces.
It makes sense.
Think about it ancestrally. A cave, a narrow gorge, any space where you can't fully assess your environment. These are places where predators hide. And crucially, they're places where your ability to escape or fight is severely restricted.
And modern horror just uses this relentlessly.
Oh,
I
constantly.
mean, even the most sophisticated films, they still rely on that classic trope of characters foolishly going into the ominous basement alone. We see it in The Conjuring, we see it everywhere.
It's a formula because it works. That immediate sense of vulnerability it's universal.
Yeah.
But the best examples, they take this fear of enclosure and they weaponize it beyond just a dark staircase.
So we need to look at scenes that really maximize that claustrophobia and the fear of the unseen threat within those spaces.
Let's start with a recent one, the French arachnophobia film, Infested.
Okay.
The scene is set in a small enclosed bathroom, and you feel the claustrophobia immediately because the space is so small, it's so domestic, and there's nowhere to go.
And the character is looking for a single spider they saw, which is that's incredibly relatable.
Yeah.
That moment of relief when you think you've got it, and then the panic when you realize you've lost it.
The tension builds because of, as the source notes, not knowing where it is, and then the true horror arrives. Dozens more spiders crawl out from the shower drain, just instantly violating the sanctity of that space.
And in that small enclosed room, escape is impossible. You're trapped by the walls, and the threat is no longer a single enemy, it's a swarm that's everywhere, but it's still hidden by the geometry of the room.
The panic is maximized because that small room acts like a literal pressure cooker. It denies you the psychological comfort of just having space to run.
That's terrifying, but it's still about a visible threat, even if there are a lot of them.
Yeah.
For the absolute ultimate in physical directional terror, we have to talk about the Irish horror film, Caveat.
Oh, this film. Criminally underseen.
It really is. So the film is about Isaac, a drifter who takes a job guarding this psychologically disturbed woman, and he finds himself chained to a harness inside this decrepit house on an island.
The whole premise is claustrophobic.
But the scene that just embodies this evolutionary threat involves Isaac trying to escape through a crawl space, a space designed for pipes, not for a person.
And the physical limitation is so important. We don't just see that it's tight, we hear him. He's audibly grunting, scraping against the stone. The source material highlights this visceral sound of the struggle because it's so tight he can barely move. He is instantly helpless.
Unable to turn around, unable to orient himself.
And the horror shifts from just discomfort to absolute psychological dread when his flashlight catches the decaying face of a corpse in the distance.
A corpse of a woman we know used to live there. And then she's gone.
And then comes that horrific realization. Isaac knows he can't turn around. It's too tight. As the critique says, he knows he needs to head exactly where that woman was.
The audience just feels the full weight of that. He is physically trapped in a narrow tunnel, a perfect environment for a predator, and his only option for survival is to move directly toward the danger he just saw.
His muffled shudder of fear is the perfect reaction. He is directionally forced into a confrontation while being completely unable to fight or retreat. It's the ultimate expression of being physically compromised.
Wow. And then, separately but related, you have the pure fear of darkness itself, nyctophobia.
Which links directly back to that ancestral fear of the unseen predator that can strike without any warning.
A phenomenal example of this is in Session 9, which takes place in an abandoned insane asylum.
Classic setting.
A classic. And the asylum sits on top of these expansive tunnels and basements. So the terror here isn't about tightness, like in Caveat.
Yeah.
It's about being swallowed by vast, empty, dark space.
The setting itself is oppressive.
And the scene focuses on Jeff, a character who has clinical nyctophobia. The generator, which is powering the few lights in the tunnels, suddenly cuts out.
And the film intercuts, showing other characters' reactions, but it just builds this crushing sense of dread, specifically for Jeff.
The most terrifying moment is watching him try to outrun the creeping darkness before he is swallowed whole. Darkness itself becomes the antagonist. It is the unseen, formless predator closing in on him.
It's a pure exploitation of vulnerability that comes from having no visibility. Your mind just fills that void with immediate threats, and your high arousal fear state just spikes.
And this architectural terror, this confinement, it can also serve a powerful thematic function, right? It can act as a moral arena.
Absolutely, which we see so powerfully in Neil Marshall's film The Descent.
Right. The protagonists are spelunking in an unexplored cave system in North Carolina, an environment that is just inherently restrictive, hostile, and completely cut off from the world.
And the cave isn't just a hiding place for the creatures they find down there. It forces the characters, especially the protagonist Sarah, to confront much more than just monsters.
She's dealing with the recent loss of her husband and child, and the betrayal of her closest friend Juno, who was having an affair with her late husband. So the environment becomes a kind of mirror for her own psychological state.
Right. The critique we looked at noted that the cave acts as a crucible for human nature under extreme pressure. Sarah's eventual redemption is it's entirely secular and violent.
She confronts Juno down there in the confinement of the cave. She doesn't rely on spiritual guidance or forgiveness. She chooses radical self-reliance.
Her ascent to the surface is earned by deliberately injuring and abandoning her so-called toxic friend Juno, leaving her for the vampire goblins, while Sarah crawls desperately toward the light, relying only on her own fortitude.
The cave, by cutting her off from everything, forces her to trust only herself. It makes it a moral arena where she has to cut out or cut down the community that failed her instead of relying on faith to survive.
It's a crucial contrast, and we'll get back to it later, but it just shows how confinement doesn't just scare the body. It can strip away the foundations of community and faith, forcing a purely individual and often brutal resolution.
Okay, let's talk about a technique that is maybe even more exhausting for the audience than physical confinement or sonic shock.
Yeah.
Let's talk about negative space.
Yes, the art of suggestion.
Exactly. This is where the filmmaker uses the empty corner of the frame, or the area just behind a character, or the off-screen zone to suggest a threat is present, even if nothing has actually materialized yet.
And this technique directly targets what we defined earlier as hypervigilance. Can you define that for us again in, conversational terms?
Absolutely. Hypervigilance is basically that exhausting feeling of constantly checking behind the shower curtain or scanning the shadows in your peripheral vision, even when you know nothing is confirmed to be there.
Right.
It's your brain's desperate high-energy state of searching for the threat. And negative space forces the audience to do that detective work for the filmmaker.
And if James Wan is the master of sonic restraint, then director Mike Flanagan is arguably the contemporary maestro of empty space.
Especially in a film like Ouija, Origin of Evil.
Oh, absolutely. Our sources highlight his deliberate technique of utilizing empty space and the framing of his shots to toy with his unsuspecting audience. He trains you to focus on the center, where the action is, but the threat almost always comes from the periphery.
Or from an unexpected vertical vector.
Exactly.
See this play out so well in that film. Flanagan rarely uses cheap cuts to reveal the ghosts. Instead, he keeps the audience guessing. Like, he might end a scene with the characters turning away, but the camera just lingers on an empty wall or corner.
And the subsequent reveals are strategically deployed from those empty spaces. You have that sudden, shocking reveal of the possessed girl, Doris, on the ceiling, or the hanged body grabbing Paulina from off-screen in the dark.
The negative space generates the anticipation, and the reveal comes from a completely unexpected angle up, sideways, or Doris crawling on the wall, like Spider-Man. You are never allowed to relax your gaze, because the empty space itself has been weaponized.
It forces you into this state of visual fatigue.
It really does. But negative space can also be used on a microscopic, hyper-realistic level, forcing the audience into a detective role that feels terrifyingly real.
And we see that silent, terrifying stare in Bong Joon-ho's Korean thriller Memories of Murder.
Which, as the source material correctly notes, it's a stretch to call it pure horror. It's a crime thriller based on a true story.
But the psychological tension it creates rivals any supernatural film out there.
Absolutely. The scene we're talking about is late in the film. We're watching a woman. She's singing alone at night in the pouring rain, waiting for a bus. She hears someone whistling along with her song, but it's distant.
And she nervously scans the surrounding high, wet grass with her flashlight. Sees nothing, just empty space and shadows.
This is a perfect example of microscopic negative space. The crucial element here is that the film is withholding information from the character, who sees nothing, but not from the audience.
Yeah.
If you're paying close enough attention.
Right. The source notes that if the audience looks closely, they will notice the killer's head peeking out of the high grass in the distance, watching her.
And that is just chilling. The filmmaker is forcing the audience into a state of extreme hyper-awareness. You're scanning the background, you're playing the detective, you're confirming the threat is there and concealed, which is so much more terrifying than a direct jump scare.
The tension is amplified because, but the character is just obliviously singing, completely vulnerable.
You feel that profound sense of helplessness. You, the viewer, you were right there. You detected that microscopic threat in the negative space, and you couldn't warn her. You couldn't save her.
And the scene culminates in that harrowing shot of the killer crawling out of the grass and catching her. The negative space has successfully leveraged your own helplessness into absolute dread.
And finally, let's look at the Japanese film pulse, or Kairo, which just challenges all Western horror expectations by lingering so intensely on negative space and using very unusual movement.
The director, Kiyoshi Kurosawa, is noted in our source material as maybe the best horror director of the 21st century. And it's because his work is so often predicated on this quiet, sustained unease rather than loud shocks.
And the scene in question is it's atmospheric and it's slow. A boy enters a dark, empty apartment.
The dread is built primarily through the audio first.
Mm.
This eerie score, a woman's echoey mechanical bellow, it starts before we see anything, building that high arousal state.
And there's no rapid cutting. The camera just lingers on the empty hallway. When the character finally turns around, we can only make out the lower body of a woman in the deep shadows, and the camera just holds the shot.
And the figure approaches, as the source says, in such an ethereal way. And this is the key to Kurosawa's genius. The movements are so unusual, like something struggling to mimic a person's movements.
It's not a fluid ghost or a lurching zombie.
No, it's hesitant, it's unnatural, it's deeply unsettling. That profound lack of natural, fluid human motion, combined with that lingering shot in the shadows, it just maximizes your discomfort and hypervigilance.
Your brain is desperately trying to categorize what it's seeing. What is wrong with that walk? Why is it moving that way?
And the film makes you wait. It forces you to compute what is fundamentally incorrect about that figure in the empty space before the ghost finally stumbles and reveals its face. It's sustained psychological intrusion over a simple startle response.
Yeah.
So we've meticulously analyzed these technical tricks, the sonic anchors, the architectural confines, the empty frames, but even the best technical scare is it's inert without emotional stakes.
Right.
So we have to pivot now to the thematic underpinnings and the critical consensus on what truly makes these films resonate, starting with the spiritual grounding of James Wan's biggest success.
Okay. James Wan is widely noted as a master of horror and a student of cinema. When The Conjuring came out in 2013, it was critically praised as a classy throwback. It was celebrated for having this old-school restraint compared to the genre trends of the time.
And this critical praise is important because, as one of our sources notes, it suggests The Conjuring was being graded on a curve.
Graded on a curve.
Yeah, especially when you compare it to the torture porn trend that Wan himself had helped pioneer a decade earlier with Saw.
Okay, I see.
Critics loved it for being relatively gore-free and relying on atmosphere and performance. They were positioning it as elevated horror to try and draw in older audiences who grew up on shockers built from performances rather than CGI.
But this leads us to a fundamental question about the film's structure.
Yeah.
Its lack of skepticism. The Conjuring is, as the source says, incredibly credulous.
Incredibly, unlike its predecessors, films like The Exorcist or Poltergeist, where the characters spend a significant amount of time clinging to rationality, to science, to psychology.
But they fight it.
They fight it. In The Conjuring, once the Warrens arrive, nobody doubts for a second that demons and witches are real.
And that immediate surrender to the supernatural, some critics argue, it fundamentally undermines the psychological process of dread.
How so?
Well, once everything is immediately confirmed as demonic, the bad smell is the devil, the knocking in threes is mocking the Trinity, the mystery is just gone. And that fight for rationality is often the most terrifying part of these stories.
Absolutely. The terrifying moment in a film like The Exorcist is watching a character, a doctor, a parent, even a priest, wrestle with their entire worldview being utterly shattered by an undeniable irrational force.
That battle creates a powerful proxy for the audience. We, the rational viewers, are fighting right alongside those skeptical characters.
And when they finally surrender, we surrender with them. And that confirmation of the supernatural is terrifying because our entire worldview has been compromised.
But in The Conjuring, the Warrens, who are these pious Catholics, they arrive with zero doubt. They immediately confirm the worst. The film operates on this presumption that any skepticism will undermine the horror.
When the opposite is often true.
Exactly. The lack of doubt removes that crucial psychological bridge between the audience's logic and the film's premise.
Yeah.
So the audience is then engaging primarily with the technical jump scares, not the psychological dread of the unknown.
And the film deliberately establishes this powerful contrast between the Warrens and the victim family, the Perrons.
Right. The Warrens are pious Catholics whose faith strengthens their resolve against this external evil. And that is contrasted with the bruised timidity of the Perrin family, who are pointedly described as not being church-going.
So the parents' lack of faith combined with their immense financial stress. Roger is a truck driver supporting a huge family during 1970s stagflation. It makes them vulnerable.
The horror is framed around a lack of spiritual grounding and the vulnerability that economic and spiritual instability can create.
And this setup is fundamental to the thematic resolution of the film. The power of familial love as an antidote to isolated darkness is key.
Even if the mother, Carolyn, ultimately defeats the demon by remembering the pure love she has for her family, which is a secular emotional memory, not a formal conversion or prayer.
Right, but the film still emphasizes communal spiritual strength. Faith is presented as sufficient, even if it's not strictly necessary, for overcoming this external evil.
Okay, now let's compare that spiritual and communal framework directly to the purely secular, self-reliant redemption we talked about earlier in The Descent.
The contrast is night and day. The Conjuring suggests that external evil requires community and spiritual strength to overcome.
Right.
The Descent suggests that survival requires the absolute sacrifice of community and reliance only on the self. Sarah finds her redemption not through a higher power or reconciliation,
No.
but by navigating the crucible of the cave, accepting the brutality of her own nature, and relying solely on her own physical and mental strength.
She doesn't find faith. She finds resolve. She ascends to the sunlight, having done what was necessary, abandoning her toxic friend, Juno, to the monsters below.
The message is self-trust and survival. You are enough, but you must be ruthless. The cave acts not as a spiritual testing ground, but as an evolutionary one.
And this contrast, it highlights two very different horror frameworks, doesn't it? One where the horror is external and requires faith and community to defeat.
And another where the horror is internal or inevitable, and survival requires radical self-trust and a willingness to sacrifice community for self-preservation.
Which brings us right back to why character grounding is the foundation for all of these technical scares. The critique noted that when characters in The Conjuring are flat, specifically mentioning the daughters being poorly differentiated, where you can't tell them apart,
Yeah, I remember that.
the audience can't engage with the film on any level other than horror.
And if the audience doesn't care about the people, whether they're driven by faith or skepticism or trauma, the scares become psychologically empty.
It means that the big, overblown final showdown, as one source puts it, just becomes noise.
Exactly. All the best sonic and visual tricks in the world, the corrupted clap, the empty corners, the tight basements, they require emotional stakes to truly resonate.
It's the difference between being startled by a loud noise and fearing for someone's soul. If you don't fear for the character's life because you're invested in who they are, the jump scare is just a startle.
But if you are invested, that corrupted sound is the sound of their safe world falling apart, and that's what truly stays with you.
The ultimate lesson here is that horror only works when the psychological techniques, the sonic anchors in negative spaces, are built on a foundation of human vulnerability and moral context.
So if we look back at the mechanics of contemporary horror, we've really distilled three major interlocking insights from your source material. We saw the profound psychological impact of sound deployment,
Right.
specifically how turning a familial domestic sound like a clap into a sonic anchor triggers this exhausting high arousal state of dread.
We also analyzed how filmmakers exploit our ancestral evolutionary fears through architectural design using basements, crawl spaces, and dark hallways to maximize that primal terror of enclosed spaces where we feel physically compromised.
And crucially, we understood the mastery of negative space, the empty frame, which forces the audience into a state of hypervigilance. It makes us scan the shadows and corners for the unconfirmed threat.
Yeah, whether it's a ghost moving unnaturally in the shadows or the tiny hidden face of a killer peeking out of high grass in the distance.
The most effective horror, regardless of its framework, always utilizes our own cognitive processes against us.
It forces us to actively participate in the act of detection and anticipation, whether by filling in the blanks in the darkness or fighting for our character's rationality.
The ultimate fear isn't what the filmmaker shows you. It's the realization that your own brain is finishing the filmmaker's work.
So the next time you sit in the quiet aftermath of a great horror film and you feel that primal urge to look over your shoulder in a dark hallway, remember, the fear doesn't just come from the screen, it comes from the empty corners of your mind.